Thank you for joining our event today, How Enterprises Can Accurately Measure Carbon Emissions. I'm Cassandra Julien, I'm Head of Global PR and Communication, and will guide you through this session today. We have a great lineup, and I really hope you will enjoy the discussions. This webinar is recorded and will be available afterwards to watch back. Now, before kicking off today, let me tell you a little bit more about Normative. We deliver the world's most accurate carbon emissions profile through Scope 1, 2, and 3, so that you can make immediate and verifiable reductions in your organization's emissions. Our mission is to make known and reduce the sustainability impact of all economic activities on the planet. We are deeply rooted in science, technology, and academia. And what that means, our co-founder and CEO Christian Rönn, previously, before founding Normative, he was working at Oxford University mitigating climate risk. We are the founding software provider and a founding partner of the SME Climate Hub, where we help smaller businesses calculate and reduce their emissions. And we have long-lasting relationships with technology, including leading companies such as Google. We work with value chain leaders. We know that legislation is coming requiring businesses to report on their full value chain, including Scope 3 emissions. At Normative, we do just that. We help businesses account for and reduce their emissions throughout their value chain, including Scope 3. Now, what that means is that Normative serves the interconnected businesses that make up the world's biggest value chains, including food, beverage, and household products. Normative has 3 foundational cornerstones. Comprehensive coverage, meaning we cover the full scope of your business, Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We have intelligent automation, meaning that we spend our time doing the calculations so that you can spend your time on making those reductions. And we're founded on scientific integrity. We work with many customers across the globe. Here are some examples for you to see. To mention some, SEB, Hertz, Eltel, Vitamin Well, amongst others. You can read more about our customers and stories on our website. Just to lift one, we worked with Eltel to take control of their value chain emissions and make those reductions in Scope 3. Now, moving on to the next point of the agenda, kicking off the discussions, we are going to have a fireside chat. With us today, we have Mattias Frömmery, head of the Swedish delegation to COP27, and Christian Rönn, CEO and co-founder of Normative. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mattias, with COP coming up next week, what do you hope it will bring?
Well, we have a huge emissions gap to close. So from the Swedish and EU perspective, I think the main task for us is to ensure that we can provide the momentum we need for closing the emissions gap. So having an outcome from COP27 which sort of points us in a direction where we can see that countries will be both sort of living up to the commitments they've made, but also accelerating action to ensure that we actually close the gap.
And this is action. The last COP was very much about the overall framework, and now we're hoping to see some action. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, but I think many people have been saying that we're sort of moving from negotiations to implementation. We had the Paris Agreement in 2015, and the so-called rule book for the Paris Agreement, which we concluded at COP26 last year. So yes, there is now time for action, and that's also what we're hearing from our Egyptian hosts, that they want to focus more on action.
And Christian, talking about the gaps, we often talk about several gaps, so also the accuracy gap. Can you clarify that a little bit?
In order to clarify that, I think it's important to take a bit of a step back. So last year at COP, the most important thing was to get the commitments in place, right? And we have the commitments in place now. They're shy from where they need to be, but committing is just the first kind of gap. What we face next is an action gap. Taking commitments, it's easy, but following through with the commitments is hard. and especially from an enterprise perspective, because we need to remember that even though we have governments going to COP, it is the companies within the jurisdictions of those governments that need to decarbonize. So then you need to look at the net zero targets of enterprises as well, individual enterprises. And what we see there is that a lot of them, I think next to 15,000 have committed to net zero. But if you look under the hood on those net zero commitments, there is an accuracy gap. So that means that those net zero commitments mostly take the emissions within the operations of those companies into account, but it ignores the value chains. So there's a gap of around 80% in terms of what companies actually include in their net zero targets. So what we're saying essentially is that, okay, we're on our way to bridge the commitment gap, but in order to bridge the action gap, we also need to bridge the accuracy gap. So in the end of the day, what gets measured gets managed, and companies are not going to be able to go to net zero unless we have the right tracking and accounting and include all of the emissions in our net zero targets.
Thank you. And that's very much the role of the enterprises and the businesses to do this work on the accuracy gap. But governments also play a role in terms of closing these gaps. What would you say are the government's role in this drive forward?
Well, if we look at it sort of at different levels, I mean, first, if we look at the global level, I mean, again, we set the Paris Agreement where we sort of committed ourselves to limiting global temperature rise to 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees. We also set ourselves to enhance the resilience of our societies, sort of to withstand climate change. And then finally, the third commitment in the Paris Agreement is to transform financial flows to support the implementation of those first two, the temperature goal and the adaptation goal. So, I mean, that's one role for governments, to set those kind of sort of the targets. And then, of course, another role for governments is to actually implement those targets in your national jurisdiction. So in our case, we've had the Swedish climate policy framework setting our 2045 target, for example. And that is something where when we engage with other governments globally, to see how can we, what kind of targets do they set and how can we support them in establishing those kind of ambitious targets, which we hope that all governments can set. So that's sort of the second role for governments, to actually then implement what we've agreed on the global level. But then, of course, the third role can also be sort of to say, what kind of incentives can government provide to actually spur that kind of action across society, business actors and others, which will be part of the transition. And of course, that needs to be different depending on what country you're in and sort of what kind of starting point you have. But I mean, I think from our perspective, it would be very much sort of setting the right kind of regulatory framework for countries or for companies to take those steps and sort of to make sure that there is an investment climate in place which sort of incentivizes investments in these kinds of sectors which would then be supporting the transition to net zero. So I think there are a couple of roles there for governments, both at a global, national level, where governments sort of have a key role to play to incentivize the transition within society at large.
Yeah. And Christian, from your opinion, are the governments doing enough in this field, or would you like to see anything different coming from this COP and other governmental initiatives?
I mean, obviously, governments can always do more. And I think the interplay between governments and businesses are very much what you described, right? Governments need to put the right frameworks in place that incentivizes companies to do the right thing. Because in the end of the day, it is companies that need to get the job done. I mean, it's not the buildings of governments or governmental enterprises in most cases that release the carbon emissions. It's the private enterprises within the jurisdictions of the governments, as I said before. So I think governments need to set clear frameworks that incentivizes companies to decarbonize. But I think governments also need to put in place the right type of benchmarks and metrics for carbon accounting, amongst other things, to make sure that if we have a company with a specific net zero target, it is possible for all stakeholders to say that, you know, the carbon emissions of this company and the decarbonization is comparable to this company. Because if you don't have that comparability that we have in financial markets, we can't really guide the incentives in the right direction. So investors and the financial industry needs to be able to know what are those carbon emissions and are they comparable in order to invest in the right decarbonization solutions. And there's a lot of, you know, good initiatives going on there, but obviously in the end of the day, more things can be done and needs to be done by our governments and businesses as well, obviously.
Yes, standardization and carbonization. And I actually have a question for you now. Are the enterprises and businesses doing enough in this field based on the incentives that you're setting?
I think my answer would be the same as Christian's, that we all need to do more. Yeah. You know, countries need to do more, and companies need to do more globally to make sure that we actually close the emissions gap. But maybe just to highlight also, I mean, a couple of elements which we've been working on within the UNFCCC process. I mean, one would be what we call the enhanced transparency framework, which was agreed at COP26 last year, which sort of sets the metrics for countries, and in this case, sort of to measure the emission reductions, but also sort of other parts of, you know, for example, when it comes to climate adaptation. So we have in that sense sort of a global regulatory framework for measuring progress when it comes to implementation. I mean, that is a framework which will be implemented over time, because there is a lack of capacity in developing countries in many cases, sort of to ensure that you would have the possibility to actually have that data and those kind of institutions in place. But I mean, the direction is clear. We have that framework which sort of kicks in starting 2024. Partly linked to that is also the framework we have for what we call the Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, where there is an agreement then between countries that we can use sort of emission reductions in other countries, sort of to account for emission reductions in one's own country, and there's sort of a system being set in place for that, which sort of links then to the transparency framework. But maybe also to highlight sort of work where we're seeing in the financial markets, and that's something which we'll actually be discussing now at COP27, where, I mean, again, the third commitment or the third goal of the Paris Agreement on transforming financial flows is not something which we've sort of been diving into so much at the global level. So, or at least within the UNFCCC process. I mean, there's a lot of work ongoing in financial markets, both, you know, in Sweden, in Europe, in other jurisdictions as well. But what we're hoping to see now at COP27 is sort of to start to, within the climate negotiation process, get a better overview of what jurisdictions are doing to support and incentivize financial markets to actually transform their financial flows. So hopefully sort of that kind of overview can also help markets globally to be more sort of forward-leaning when it comes to climate action.
Yeah. And I want to dive into you talking also about the developing countries versus those that are developed countries and the kind of difference in actions that we might see from there. This also relates very much to the value chain and the production and how businesses are set up and how they operate. Can you talk a little bit, Christian, on why the value chains are so key in the emission reductions and the kind of how we need to support the markets and the businesses operating in those markets that don't necessarily have the same advancements as other markets?
Great question. In the end of the day, the decarbonization of the world economy is the decarbonization of global value chains. So if you take, for instance, the phone that I have in my pocket, it has, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of different parts, and it goes through hundreds, if not thousands of different production steps. Everything from mining of precious metals in sub-Saharan Africa to the manufacture of microchips in East Asia, to manufacturing of optics in Northern Europe, for instance, and then assembling all of that in China. So there are so many steps. So in order to decarbonize the world economy, we all need to work together in order to decarbonize those value chains. And a first important step, and I think this relates back to the accuracy gap, is to make sure that Scope 3, which is the value chain-based emissions, are included in the net zero targets of all companies, and that you can actually track progress in the Scope 3. Because you have to, I think it's also kind of linked to a climate justice and fairness perspective. Because if we take a step back, us in the global north, I mean, we are in this mess to a large extent because we in the global north industrialized through the use of cheap hydrocarbons. And in order for the global south to be able to have, you know, a fair transition, I think it is up to companies and governments to work together with those supply chains and put the right incentives in place, not just in manufacturing in their own jurisdiction, but incentivizing the all of the other suppliers in the global south to take that same transition as well. And that incentive piece can't happen if we don't take value chains seriously and if we don't track emissions properly in those value chains.
That's a very good point. We're coming to close of this discussion, but before that, I would very much like to hear your opinion. Are we on track to the net zero targets?
No.
Christian, what do you think?
Very, very simple answer. It's a no. And we need to do more, and that's why everyone is gathering around COP in order to, you know, revitalize and hopefully bring us a bit closer to those targets, because it is, you know, it's the future flourishing of our societies and planet Earth that is at stake.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, Matthias and Christian. Very interesting to talk to you. I hope to see more of you at COP in the weeks to come. It's time to welcome our next guest, Jytte Guteland, member of the Swedish Parliament and former member of the European Parliament. So let's see if we have Jytte with us today. Welcome. You have just transitioned into your new role in the Swedish Parliament, leaving the European politics behind. And one of the things you were talking about is that you want to work closer to home and work with climate questions. We'd be very interested to hear more about how do you see industry, governments and climate linking up together in tackling climate change?
Thank you for having me in this very important conversation. I believe they are linking up well. I think the industry and climate should go hand in hand. So much of the emissions actually come from the industry, but I also have lots of hope when I see the development, not at least in Sweden and with all the innovation taking place at this very moment. It feels really like a historic moment living now and experiencing what the industry is doing. So I think it can link up very fine together, climate and industry. But I think the industry needs to be very firm that this is the route to the future. This is the way ahead. We are not slowing down or taking another road. We need to continue to reduce the emissions very rapidly.
Thank you. And in your experience working both in European politics and national politics, what is the single most important a business can do in terms of tackling climate change?
I believe it is, of course, the innovation to get rid of the greenhouse gas emissions and have lots of cooperation between all the also the community and the state, and have together, like it's done in Sweden in many places right now, a strong will to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and have be very firm in turning the innovation in that direction and also the money in that direction. So I believe that's the most important thing from industry. And then, of course, have a tight dialogue with this legislators and other stakeholders on how we can cooperate to do this together.
Money, innovation, and dialogue and cooperation, we fully agree with you. And I think there are a lot of people also listening in that will reaffirm these messages. And if that's the business role, then what do you see the government's role is in terms of tackling climate change?
I think it is the same in one way. I think it is about the money, it is about the innovation, making sure on a state level that we have enough money to the both science, innovation, industry to help this transition. But I also, of course, believe it's important for the member states in the European Union that they are very cooperative on this, and that the states are not using this difficult moment that we are living in to slow down, because I believe that would be the wrong signal for everyone, and it is a U-turn back to where we don't want to be. I really believe that this is not spending the money correctly. We need to continue. We need to fulfill the European climate law. We need to fulfill the climate package now this year when the legislation is taking place on the EU level. And we also need the money to be spent in a wise way. And fossil fuels are not a very clever way to invest in this very moment in time.
Yes, thank you. And is the government doing enough as it is today, or would we like to see more action when it comes to climate and incentives?
I don't think that the governments are doing enough. I think we have a big problem at this moment that many of them believe that we have done enough. We have the climate law, we have the climate package going on. But on the other hand, we have recent climate reports showing that we are going above 3 degrees. And we are not fulfilling the Paris Agreement at all. And also this pact that was formulated in Glasgow, this Glasgow Pact, that we were going to have higher NDCs. It's at this moment, it seems like the council is not fulfilling that, and that would be a mistake, I believe. I think also it's kind of weak signal to the industry and also to the citizens. If the signal is mixed with maybe we could take a pause, maybe we could have a moratorium on the climate legislation, these kind of political signals are harmful, I believe, for the industry also. In the medium term time, I think that means that we spend money in the wrong direction, and that is not very helpful for the European industry. So I think also many times I hear, not at least front runners in Sweden, from industries in Sweden, that they say we need to have clear signals. We don't want mixed signals, because that's scary in a way. And I think that's also what the governments need to hear.
Yes, and I fully agree. Time for action is now, and let's not sit around and wait for climate change to fix itself. We need to engage now and create the correct incentives for things to move in the right direction. What is your biggest hope and expectation for the future in terms of reaching net zero? What do you hope to see in the years coming forward?
I really hope that we are not only going to fulfill the climate law of reducing at least 55% on the greenhouse gas emissions if you compare to 1990. So I really hope that this will be not only fulfilled, but also actually that we will do better than that. And I think that's possible. I think if everyone is clear that we are not going to take this other route, we are not taking a U-turn back to very conservative politics, then I do believe it's possible, because I've seen it before as a legislator that the industry is actually overachieving when it's clear what's needed to be done. And I think that's possible. But then, of course, it is about cooperation between different sectors. It's not only the industry. The whole society needs to be there and do their part. So the climate law is spreading the responsibility among. And then also, I also believe that the climate package that is negotiated at this moment needs to be fulfilled before next summer, I think, to give some time for everyone to adopt to it. So that is also a bit of a fear from my side, that the ETS would be prolonged and not send the signals that it needs to do, and be also put in place in time. So that's something that I'm a bit afraid of at this moment, that it's taking so long.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us today. Very insightful, and we really look forward to following your work going forward. It's time to invite our panel following this session, and let's hear directly from the businesses that are working with enterprise reduction at hand. Welcome. Really pleased to have you here. Starting from my right, we have Millie Park, Non-Executive Director and ESG Advisor. We have Stephen Jameson, Global Head of Circular Economy Solutions at SAP. And we have Maggie Buggy, COO of Normative. Let's dig straight into it. Why should businesses care about their carbon footprint to start off with? Millie.
Thank you. I think businesses should care greatly because they have a heavy responsibility to many stakeholders in their ecosystem, not the least of whom are customers, investors, and employees, and perhaps I can even say themselves. So if you think about the transition to a low GHG economy, it will be massive, it will be asymmetrical, and the markets will not have yet reflected across all companies this change in what's happening. And therefore, I'll be an optimist for a moment and say that there's a huge opportunity for companies to capture value from that market asymmetry. And if you think about the way capital flows in society, capital flows towards value. So for those companies who understand that and are able to capture that value from being responsible in how they do business, then the capital will flow to them. There's, of course, the pessimistic side, which I can possibly get into a bit later.
I love that. Capital flows to value. Stephen, what is your take on businesses caring about sustainability?
Yeah, but I think it comes down to impact. We look at the challenge we have in the world today, the sheer magnitude of the carbon challenge, never mind every other crisis that we can think of attributed to that, and the role that business plays. 45% of the world's CO2 comes down to how we use and consume products, essentially. So business has a significant role to play in not just their own operations, but in terms of how we transition as a global society into a more sustainable future.
Yeah. And Maggie, you obviously work with businesses across the spectrums in your role at Normative. Does this echo and resonate well with what you hear from our customers as well?
Oh, absolutely. I 100% agree with Millie and Stephen. And I think the only thing that we haven't mentioned to date is also the employee perspective. Stephen and Millie have already talked about the customer piece, the value piece, also the opportunity for impact. But it's also fundamentally about businesses' ability to compete in the future from a point of view of attracting and retaining talent who are increasingly qualifying the companies that they will be associated with based on their commitments to net zero.
Yeah. Millie, you have several hats on as non-executive director, following a lot of businesses, and you have a history with big enterprises such as Tesco's, Marks and Spencer's. What's your learning in engaging with these business communities? What trends have you seen working with those businesses in terms of their transition to a more sustainable pathway?
I think so. One of the challenges I think right now is we've had so many shocks to the markets in the past couple of years that reprioritizing sustainability has become an agenda point, but one that perhaps has taken a bit of a backseat for many companies. And in particular, the drive to better disclosures has given a lot of companies lots of busy work, but perhaps without thinking about the value to the ecosystem, as others have mentioned. And I would say a couple of things. One is disclosure is important, but actually not thinking about this as a value creation opportunity, but instead thinking about it as a cost or a reporting exercise is actually quite short-sighted. And if we think about decades and decades of how companies globally have performed and who's come out on top in each sector, one thing you'll find if you look at pretty much every decade is that those names change at the top. And that's usually because there's some big global disruption that's happened. So one could argue that the last one was around digital, still happening. There's sort of a whole number of things that have happened across each decade, but certainly sustainability is a global disruptor. It's a global necessity. And companies will soon find that if they treat this as a cost or disclosure only exercise, they'll actually miss that giant value creation opportunity.
That's a very, very good insight. However, a lot of businesses are reporting their financial data, most businesses, on a quarterly basis, and they will struggle driving these conversations internally, having the more long-term insights. What would you advise those businesses to kind of use as a core argument? The business opportunity for sure that you're stressing. Anything else you'd like to add to that?
I think it'd be very easy to think about this from a short-term perspective, in particular as we, in many parts of the world right now, are dealing with economic crises and such. But I would say a couple of things. One is, if we don't set ourselves up as companies for the longer term, that short-term thinking, as it always has in history, will not serve us well. And in particular, as we are faced with, really for the first time, a multi-generational sort of layer of, or layers of customers, and particularly for those who might be newer customers, as we think about Gen Z and Generation Alpha, who will soon have lots of wallet power, it's quite important to remember that values that they grew up in is actually slightly different than for those of older generations. And so customers have to be thinking longer term, because it isn't just about financial performance, but it's about reputation and the link to customers that we've talked about earlier.
Yeah, but I agree with you. It's all about the long term. If you are too short term, you will run into those missed opportunities and risks. Stephen, what's an enterprise role? I mean, you're obviously at the very heart of it in tackling these value chain emissions and carbon reductions. How do you work with that?
Well, I think let's just look at a bit of context first off. 20 years ago, it was okay for organizations just to understand what's going on in their four walls, wind that clock forward, and being able to look at sort of one tier in a supply chain is perhaps where ambition has perhaps got to in many cases. But the reality is, if enterprises are not getting that true understanding of the ultimate land use impact, the ultimate impact of decisions they're making, both in terms of upstream materials, but also in terms of downstream waste, what's the CO2 impact of the materials we're putting into society? Organizations are very significantly going to be creating, embedding challenges for themselves. We have a number of different sort of regulatory instruments that are on the way here, not just on the climate agenda, but on the waste agenda and on biodiversity, which are really ensuring that businesses need to have this holistic picture, this sort of end-to-end understanding. The key thing here is that businesses need to really act. What we see is a lot of organizations sort of waiting for the right standard to come along, waiting for the right regulation, waiting for that moment where they kind of must act. But the reality is the time to act is now. And the quicker we're able to really start to ask those difficult questions, really start to get that transparency on what's happening upstream, the quicker organizations can start to plan and mitigate the right actions. So I think that's our sort of initial end-to-end perspective.
Yes, and I fully agree there. Let's not sit and wait around for the, like you mentioned, standards or legislation to come along. To be proactive is the business opportunity. What's been the key driver for SAP that you're representing to change to more sustainable circular solutions? What has been their business incentive? I don't know if you're able to talk about that, but it'd be very interesting to hear.
Yeah, I think there's two perspectives within SAP. We have what we call our exemplar view, which is looking at our own impact of our own operations, which is significant, but we're a global organization, 100,000 plus employees. We don't make anything as such. So we have a perspective on the climate agenda, on the waste agenda, and the wider sustainability agenda, which is highly valuable, important, and something we need to take very seriously. But actually, our impact comes from the many thousands of businesses, the 400,000 businesses around the world that utilize our solutions to execute their own businesses. And so we have this dual focus in how we tackle this. And I'd say really is a multifaceted set of drivers, and we've already touched on them, right? It's that regulatory incentive that's coming on many fronts. We have the alphabet soup of different standards and different reporting requirements, which is hopefully now beginning to sort of simplify and consolidate down with the arrival of ISSB next year, and also public commitments and the kind of the collaborative work that we're doing with many NGO type organizations. So we're doing a lot of activity with the likes of the World Economic Forum, the UN Global Compact, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, all who are driving really ambitious goals and really ambitious action. And I'd say it's those things together that are really driving, our agenda.
Yes, and commitment and standardization is something we talked a lot about today, and that we keep coming back to, that it's so key in order to have effective carbon reduction. Maggie, do you want to add to this, like working with businesses across the sectors and our customers? What are some of the business opportunities and key drivers that you've seen from the customers that we worked with?
I'd say in addition to the things that we've already covered, one of the things I've been thinking as I've been listening to Millie and Stephen is that what is it that businesses depend on to be able to participate in the value creation and value opportunity that Stephen and Millie are referring to. And here we found that customers agnostic of sector and as participants in any and all value chains, they really depend on accuracy and a baseline that they can depend on. Because I think it's really important when we talk about sustainability and we talk about value creation and we talk about compliance in particular, we also have to talk about trust, and we understand the role of accurate reporting. And of course, it goes without saying, the need to avoid greenwashing, because from what I've seen across every single customer is that the business community understands there is a business value creation opportunity, but they also understand that they have to have an accurate baseline to be able to work from. And once that is in place, a big thing that everyone's coming to realize is the business value of those sustainability insights when applied within business processes and in the context of business opportunities.
Stephen, is greenwashing something that your unit or team is worried about when working with, complex issues and data and so on? And how do you kind of tackle that within your team?
It's an interesting topic, and I think I was chatting to a colleague about this earlier. It's always important to be very honest about the trade-off between R&D and marketing on this topic. And I think any organisation looking at this, watching this at the moment, should be asking honest questions of themselves about where does that ratio lie in their organisation, and making sure that the focus is very much on making things happen and driving impact and getting these topics truly integrated into kind of core business processes and driving the right insights, and less about the kind of the talking and the messaging. There's a role for that, of course. We need to make sure that we're celebrating the right activity and the right action, and it's important that we're communicating effectively to the wider world about the impact that's possible, the impact we can have, and the benefit of collaborating as a broader ecosystem. But it's very easy to sort of stray into the talking for talking's sake topic. Having said that, I do find the organisations we're working with, there's a very ingrained set of values. I think organisations are very aware of the risk of greenwashing, and I'd say, obviously not without exception, but as a general rule, most organisations are act first and communicate later on these things. So I think there's it's something we need to all be aware of as we progress this agenda.
Yes, and be honest and humble about the data that we have. If we are true about what we're actually reporting, then we're much less of a risk of greenwashing. If we are, true to the data that we have and not misleading anyone, because I think that's the biggest risk. We're so ambitious and there's so much we want to do that we tend to, be a little bit grand in our communication, compared to the data that is actually supporting that. But that's very interesting. Continuing with you, Stephen, you have a background in circularity. Leading the circular team. Can you tell us how carbon accounting fits into the circular economy and how you see that?
Yeah, so I think the key thing here is, how we use materials as a business and as a society and as an ecosystem at the end of the day. And I think when we look at the circularity topic, it all comes down to making sure that we are using materials consciously. We're eliminating waste at every opportunity. We are putting in processes to assure circularity, innovating business processes in order to keep products in use and eliminate waste from the circle, so to speak. And that we're regenerating natural systems. And I think one of the often sort of missed points on the sort of circular economy narrative is the fundamental need to take care of what we call the biocycle. Ensuring that every act that we take on the land we impact is one that drives a net positive result. Increases biodiversity. And drives a positive outcome, and I think each of these topics are fundamentally intertwined on the CO2 agenda. For every material we purchase, each material has got a inherent CO2 impact, whether that's a technical material or a biological material, and that impact needs to be understood throughout its use, whether we're talking through multiple layers of a supply chain. We need to be able to account for that material, account for its cost clearly, but ultimately account for the impact that's had and its embedded CO2 alongside other metrics. And I think one of the things that's really key to understand here is understanding that trade-off of recyclable materials, recycled content, understanding the embedded CO2 of different techniques, and understanding the benefits of new business processes, whether we're talking remanufacturing, whether we're talking as a service type models. There are many benefits in terms of the CO2 impact of more innovative approaches that need to be understood and need to be explored more generally. So having that record of CO2 spend in each material, in each step, as we seek to deliver upon those principles of a circular economy is fundamental. And it's something that all organizations are going to need to really be focusing on as we start to onboard many new regulatory interventions in this space. We've seen plastic taxes come online now in the UK, Spain and Italy in January, the UN Plastics Treaty in 2024 onwards. The EU directives around this topic for circular economy all drive a sort of trade-off conversation. They all drive a question of what's the most sustainable materials, what's the CO2 impact, and those organizations that can understand that are going to be well placed for the future.
Thank you. That's a great clarification of how it all links together and how you work with it. So, Millie, we talked a little bit about the capital flows, the opportunities, we touched upon the risks, but will a business survive that isn't accountable for the carbon emissions? Can they get away with it today? What's your take on that?
It's a great question. I think there are some businesses who think they can get away with it. And, perhaps they can for a short while. But what we are seeing is with the entire ecosystem that we mentioned, so it's the investors, the stakeholders, the regulators, as Stephen mentioned, the pressure is coming on quite quickly. And I've seen a number of different stats around what will happen to the values of the top 100 emitters, for example. And there are those who think that within just a few years, those top 100 emitters will lose a significant amount of value. So my question is whether or not they will survive, or it's not whether they will survive or not. My question is, if you are managing these companies, do you want to risk that and that happening to you in a couple of years? And so the other way I would think about it is, Stephen actually captured that whole sort of conversation around carbon accounting quite well. One of the things I often tell people that I work with, clients and whomever it is that a lot of these things that we're asking for, not only are they responsible, but they're actually really good for some of the initiatives that companies have been looking for in different ways. So if you think about in this environment, companies care a lot about cost savings for now. They care about engaging customers. They care about engaging employees. And when you think about some of the things that Stephen mentioned, I actually call them the 5 R's, which is refrain, reduce, repurpose, recycle, and regenerate. A lot of that actually gets to the heart of some of the things that companies have tried to do in years past anyway. And it's just a matter of linking those to be able to capture that value.
Yeah. And you talk about the stakeholders here. Who has the most power in terms of driving change? I mean, we know employees today, especially the young ones, they have really high demands on their businesses that they work for in terms of sustainability. We have customers that are asking more and more for sustainable products and solutions. We have the investors that, keep the capital flow going to the sustainable businesses. But who actually is the main mover, would you say, in terms of driving enterprises to sustainability? And we also have legislation. Let's not forget about that one.
That's a great question. I think it depends upon how you define power. So I'll probably say who's actually creating the most urgency right now. And I would say it's probably 2 entities more than others, but others are coming up quite quickly. I think the regulators are certainly trying to do their part. They certainly are, particularly in Europe and in the UK, and especially in certain industries like financial services. But I also think investors themselves are quite powerful in this. And we've seen lots of examples, in particular quite recently, of investors, activists and NGOs who have really voted against certain things at AGMs or in some cases displaced management and boards. And so I think there's a groundswell of power, but it's not enough. We need everyone to collectively wield this power.
Yeah. Fully agree. It's not a single man show. It's a joint effort in terms of getting there. Maggie, coming back to you, we know that this is a special time of the year because we're going into reporting season. A lot of businesses are starting to analyze their data, figuring out what they have, avoiding the greenwash traps that we talked about to make their carbon reporting. What's your learning in terms of businesses coming to Normative now? What are the challenges that they see and the kind of advice that they're seeking in terms of handling their carbon accounting?
I think we've touched on quite a few of them here today, but I would call out number 1, many businesses are wondering where to start and also are qualifying based on questions of how do you close what a lot of them refer to as the accuracy gap, how to ensure that actually their baseline is trusted and that they can be confident in the scientific integrity of the data sets that they're putting together. Secondly, we get an awful lot of questions around the ability to interrogate and understand Scope 3 because many customers, and I would say even the vast majority of customers now appreciate that if historically they've only looked at Scope 1 and 2, that isn't sufficient for the world that we're moving into. And also, as Millie has referred to in the context of value creation, and Stephen so eloquently spoke to in the context of the circular economy, to be able to, from any business's perspective, to be able to participate in those big value creation opportunities moving forward, you have to have visibility and the CO2 impact and ability to account for and understand the full end-to-end value chain. And I would say lastly, as I was listening to Stephen and Millie, the last segment, I was thinking about the word stewardship because I think from a board perspective, in the context of value chains in the world that we live in, this is fundamentally about stewardship of organizations. And I think once all the customers that I work with, first they want to be able to understand, where do I start, and can I trust the baseline that I'm working with? And secondly, what is very top of mind for them is around stewardship of their organizations and their boards, both in terms of being compliant and not being exposed from a regulatory perspective, but also in terms of stewardship of their organization's ability to create sustainable, meaningful revenue streams over time to fulfill their board responsibilities.
You mentioned where to start. Is it better to do something than nothing at all? And where is the line between accuracy and action? I know it's a super tricky question, but I think you're in a good position to tackle that one.
It is a super tricky question. I'm going to speak to the ex-management consultancy within me, management consultant within me, and always say it's best to understand and be sure that you're starting in the right place and you're working with the right ecosystem of providers within this, because I really think that in many other areas it's best to just start to do something. This isn't one of them. I'm sure many people listening here today know, as soon as you touch anything that is like driven by legislation and that touches compliance, you need to be really sure that you're doing the right thing, that you're measuring the right things, and that also that the results and the outcomes that you're reporting are not going to have a negative impact, either from a brand perception perspective, but also from an audit and compliance perspective. So I would say it's better to take the time to really understand what is it that needs to be measured. Take your time to qualify from a supplier perspective who you're working with, ensure that you have the right conversations in place and connections in place across your value chain, because as all of us, I think, have alluded to in different ways today in the conversation, this one company alone can't do this well, because the value chain involves, by definition, a massive ecosystem of companies.
And don't do it alone, right? Get the expertise and the help that knows this. And like we keep telling our customers that it's not actually that complex if you just reach out, but doing it on your own with an Excel sheet is definitely not the way to start, because that's when you start to see the accuracy pitfalls. Thank you. We touched a lot upon the value chain today and the kind of role the value chain plays in terms of emission reduction, sustainability work. And this is especially true with the globalization that we see today, that many businesses are multinational. Christian mentioned his phone, with all the components coming from different parts of the world. Some parts are assembled in one place, and then you have assembly in the third place, and all of these spider networks coming together. Millie, working with value chains and the complexity of the global environment that we have today, what would you say is the role of enterprises in terms of engaging their value chain and taking the full responsibility?
Well, let me speak from the perspective of some of the boards on which I sit. And in particular, I sit on a few boards that are investment companies. And that's a very unusual place in the value chain because as an investment company, our scope 3, for example, goes down to our portfolio companies and many of them. It's quite... The whole end-to-end piece is terribly important, because as we know that that whole value chain piece really is the majority of where carbon is emitted, particularly in scope 3. And so that notion of stewardship and engagement, stewardship which Maggie brought up, is actually quite important from that perspective. So, for example, an investment company would actively talk to the portfolio companies, the management of these companies, for example, to understand what they are doing along every aspect of not just the environment, but also the S side, as well as governance, which is quite important. But if we don't have companies who actually do that across the chain, we won't make the impact that we would like to make. We won't do the right thing by our people that we need to do, and we won't be able to create that, I'll call it the networking effect that you get. So if you're only thinking about yourself in scopes 1 and 2, you're kind of in this little bubble. But if you are actually going down that scope 3 and down the chain, you then create this interconnectivity, because there is so much interdependence operationally or geographically that just means we might get to a better place and faster.
Thank you. And Stephen, from your perspective, what have your learnings been working with value chains and complex markets? I mean, we talked about that it's not a physical product as such, but there is still suppliers and sub-suppliers and so on that you would have to deal with in terms of capturing the full scope of your footprint.
Yeah, I think there's really three kind of key topics that I think just kind of keep recurring. SAP have been helping organizations deliver kind of well-governed businesses for 50 years now. And when we address a topic like CO2 transparency across a complex supply chain, in many ways, it's no different to a financial flow. The challenge is how organizations are dealing with that. And, I think there are really three key basic behaviors that we need to establish. It's how we monitor what's happening in the external world, monitor what's happening in terms of regulations and what's happening upstream in our supply chains, how we integrate into core processes. At the end of the day, businesses make decisions, in kind of an operational context, and they are needing to embed that insight into our operational context in order to ensure that, we're making the transition as effectively as possible. But thirdly, it's about driving that stakeholder transparency and ensuring that and recognizing that stakeholders are no longer just the traditional sort of markets and investment companies that we've been perhaps reporting to for a long period of our history, but recognizing the disparate group of other stakeholders that are now have an equally valid say and interest in what we're doing, whether that's NGOs or even our end customers and the broader citizens within the markets in which we operate, and also how we then have that effective dialogue with regulators. One of the topics that we're so keen to support as SAP is just ensuring that the wheels of policy making are given the effective insight that actually helps effective policy to be constructed. And actually, many organizations want the right policy interventions to come into place. They want to see the level playing field raised. But, there is this fear that the policy making just can't quite get there, can't quite deliver what's needed. And so the better we can drive that transparency as an ecosystem, the better we can enable the right policy interventions, the right targeted innovations in policy, and the quicker change will happen.
Transparency for sure. And you keep coming back to innovations. I love that. We need to keep pushing forward and always finding the best and most science-based way to push sustainability. Millie, this is, again, a super tricky question, but I hope you will have fun tackling it. Where is the line between the business responsibility for the climate footprint and what you can place on the consumers of that product? And where is that kind of balance? When can you push something on the consumers, and where do you have to step up as an enterprise and say, well, actually, this is our responsibility?
That's a very tricky question. Thank you for that. I have a personal view on this, which is actually everyone needs to take responsibility, and whether that is at a corporate level or at a personal level, and whatever that means to each of us. And I think let me just give you a scenario. Once a corporate tries to push the responsibility onto a consumer, they then A, absolve themselves any responsibility, which defeats the purpose of what we're doing, but B, will probably lose that consumer at some point, and many more, because it will be transparent, and also it will be irresponsible, as we can imagine. So in my particular view, the buck should stop with everyone, but it should certainly stop at the corporate level, because there is more ability to make that impact at a corporate level, because you are touching so many lives across so many regions.
Thank you. And that's a very nice personal view. Maggie, what are your recommendations for businesses starting today at Net Zero? Because not everyone are as advanced and, being in their 4th reporting year or whatever. What is your advice to those that seen this webinar and thinking, we really ought to do something, this is the time to take action, let's get started?
Well, I think number one, listen to the webinar and hear the amazing points made by Stephen and Millier about understanding why this is important. I think, secondly, it's there are different. If for anyone starting now, there are great tools available to help you. I think also applying best practice in terms of how you're qualifying your providers, in terms of scientific accuracy, in terms of the integrity with which it's approached, and also understanding from the outset that the start point for you as a company might be compliance, but the potential downstream outcome is really about value creation and the ability to compete over time. Because as all three of us have touched on in this discussion, sustainability insights of business value. So I believe that we're preparing for a world whereby at scale, if I am a future chief marketing officer, I will be applying net zero sustainability business insights into my marketing campaigns to inform my brand equity. If I am a chief procurement officer, I will be qualifying all suppliers based on their externally verifiable, trusted carbon reports. I could go on. So I would say keep those two things in mind.
Thank you. We're running to an end of this great panel session. But before that, I have the trickiest question of all. In one sentence, that's the tricky part. What is your biggest learning with working with value chain engagement? Millier, let's start with you.
I would say it is treat this as a value creation exercise, not as a cost or compliance exercise.
Value creation, that's great. Stephen?
This is a collaborative effort and we need to work together, whether we're competing, whether we are, partnering, cooperating, whichever format of market, participation we have. No one organization is going to solve this alone. And the sooner organizations lock arms with those around them and drive solutions, the better.
No one alone, but everyone has a responsibility. That's fantastic. Maggie?
Opportunity and relevance, I would say. If you seek opportunity and you want to stay relevant over time, you need to get on this train and do it well.
Yes. The sustainability train is leaving. It's just a matter of whether you're on it or not. That's a big learning. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your insights. It's been very rewarding to talk to you all. I hope to see you soon again in the future.
Thank you.
Some of the key takeaways from this session today: we talked about value creation, we talked about collaborative efforts, get started, and that no one can do it alone, and the opportunity in carbon reduction. Next, let's hear from one of our customers that's hands-on done the work with Normative. We're going to hear about how they worked with Normative to address the accuracy gap. Here is Amy Wright, Sustainability Specialist at Flying Tiger Copenhagen.
So my name's Amy Wright and I work as a Sustainability Specialist at Flying Tiger Copenhagen, which I have done for almost 1.5 years now. Flying Tiger Copenhagen is a variety retail store that sources a wide range of different products and different ranges from many different countries in the world. I do think it's really a challenge to find this complete greenhouse gas accounted overview of your different business areas. And I think that's mostly based on the complexity of the data required and the just pure scope of it. I think it's really important that you have specialists who can guarantee the scientific integrity of your data. But I also think there's a big concern that you would simply miss large areas. There could be a big accuracy gap in that you might just miss areas of accounting. And that's why we love working with a trusted software provider such as Normative, because they ensure a really high degree of accuracy that is aligned to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The vast majority of our emissions are in Scope 3, well over 90%, so it's essential to track these emissions. Using software like Normative really helps us get access to a lot of information on our supply chain. Textiles form quite a small proportion of our overall product materials, but in terms of emissions, they're quite a big share of our emissions, and this was a really valuable insight for us. You might have an awareness that one material is higher in emissions than another, But to actually put a figure on that, you need greenhouse gas accounting software. The accurate emission calculations we get from Normative really empower us to make good business decisions. So that can be, for example, that we're able to identify countries with high impact energy grids and then target transitioning those countries to renewable energy first. Another example is that we identify high impact product materials and work on either reducing these or improving the materials so they are lower in emissions. I think what gets me up in the morning is seeing the reductions we can make over time and being able to track those numbers. It really is empowering to know that you're on the right pathway, but to also see this wider change in our wider industry and to see that greenhouse gas tracking is becoming the norm. I think this is an essential movement for us to reach the Paris Agreement's goals.
Thank you, Amy, for sharing these insights. Next up, we have our colleague Alexander Schmidt, Head of Science and Climate Research at Normative, who has joined us to introduce one of our latest tools from Normative. So please, tell us more.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. I'm excited to share today with you the essentials of enterprise carbon accounting, if you want, which we also have collected for you in a new guide that we just published, which is also titled The Guide to Enterprise Carbon Accounting. So let me jump right into the first part that you will find inside of this guide, and that is about the challenge for enterprises. Mainly, you can say it is threefold. First of all, enterprises will need to comply with rapidly changing and evolving climate legislation and norms. And that is so critical for companies because otherwise, right now, already in the EU and the UK, very soon, probably also in the US, they will not be compliant anymore and will face some potential fines. But also they will need to adapt to evolving and ever more demanding consumer expectations. Last but not least, they will need to reconfigure their entire value and supply chains to stay not just compliant, but also competitive in the environment that is changing so quickly right now. But maybe we can just quickly, before we dive further into challenges and solutions, zoom out a bit and look at why enterprises? Why do we right now focus so much on the enterprise topic here? Well, the challenges that I just shared with you, they are being shared among many different businesses. But enterprises, they have one thing that makes them really, really unique, and that is captured on this slide here. What you see here is that if we, based on our own research, if we just look at approximately 500 large enterprises and look at their current carbon footprint. Now, these enterprises that have committed to net zero, meaning they, by 2050, the latest, want to reduce their emissions to net zero. So if they get there, this means we have already achieved to reduce global emissions from fossil fuels and industry by roughly 40%. So that is a huge, huge step towards net zero by only 500 companies, those are enterprises. So this shows the huge potential the enterprises have to lead the charge of global decarbonization. And why is it the case? Why are enterprises so powerful in actually getting us to this net zero goal? Well, this is captured on this picture here. What you see on the left-hand side are enterprises that have a large number of suppliers, so a lot of companies in their value chain that they can actually easily engage. While on the right-hand side, you have the large number of small, medium enterprises. However, their value and supply chains are quite small. So enterprises, though they are smaller in their own sizes, so there are only a few thousands of them, they can actually have the huge impact of leading to global net zero by engaging their value and supply chains. At the same time, of course, this is not easy. Enterprises struggle because decarbonizing their supply and value chain is complex and requires a comprehensive approach. Almost 90% of their emissions are located in their value chain. At the same time, we see that right now, many companies, many enterprises only set climate targets that cover less than 40% of the overall emissions. So what we mean by the previous slides shown is true net zero. So they actually have decarbonize their entire value chain. But right now we're not there. And we're not there because it's so complicated and so complex for companies on their own to go all the way to net zero in the value chain. But why should they go there? Well, they should go there because there's so much potential here for them also to turn this into actually an opportunity. There's a lot of capital that is going to be unlocked by not just green loans and investments, but also by new consumers that are going to be drawn to purchase their products, because we see that more than 70% of customers would be willing to pay premium for green products and sustainable services. At the same time, over 2/3 of employees or potential employees are looking for employers that are actually sustainable and take the right actions in these directions. Which leads us to how can enterprises come to the place where they have actually implemented meaningful changes? Well, we have a few solutions that are actually already best practices. At the same time, there are pitfalls with these very same solutions and approaches. So it's very, very important that we mention both here. So let me just start with the first part. What is the commonly taken three-step approach to comprehensively manage your carbon emissions, your enterprise carbon emissions? Well, it always starts with, you might have guessed it, with measurement. You need to first put everything on the table. That is so, so important. Being transparent about your current emissions, even though they might be high, is nothing anyone will hold against you. You have to be transparent. What will become a problem down the road is if you do not comprehensively measure, but you carve out pieces of it and just either forget about them or willfully not ignore them. So once you have calculated, this will enable you to then act on this. You will not only be able to report and be compliant, which is of course kind of the minimum requirement you have to do, but you will also be able to meaningfully take action to engage your suppliers, your value chain, and subsequently to reduce your emissions. Last but not least, you need to follow up. Just as with your financial accounting, it is so important that your carbon accounting follows suit. You need to subsequently increase your data granularity, so the data resolution that you capture to actually assess your carbon footprint, and of course monitor improvements. Otherwise, any changes might be just lost there. However, at the same time, even though you might be doing all these best practices, there is something that we have observed in the market over and over again, and that is what we came to label the accuracy gap. We see that on average, more than 50% of emissions are being not captured by, probably in-house calculations that are done by enterprises. That is a huge problem. If you fail to assess 50% or to actually disclose more than half of your footprint, this will have severe consequences because you can't report. Well, you can report, but you will be not compliant. You will issue incomplete reports. Secondly, with incomplete measurements, you will not be able to set full targets. I mean, if you do not know what you're actually accountable for in terms of emissions, how could you then set targets to go net zero? And last but not least, it makes you very vulnerable to greenwashing allegations. Because, of course, the outsiders don't know if you have just failed to measure them, if you have willfully ignored them. It will make you prone to greenwashing allegations, and that's something, of course, you want to avoid at all costs. What does this mean? How can you then screen the market and find the right solution for you, or just know yourself how you have to do carbon accounting correctly? Well, there are three important ingredients to this. First, comprehensive coverage. That is something I cannot stress highly enough. You need to have a granular view on your emissions. We at Normative, we have, for example, more than 7,000 taxonomy classifications. This means that you don't just know I purchased a vegetable or maybe I purchased a tomato. No, you know the tomato comes from a greenhouse in the Netherlands. It has been treated with certain fertilizers. So this enables you to take informed action and, of course, as said before, comprehensively also then disclosing your emissions. Secondly, intelligently automate your carbon accounting, because Excel spreadsheets will not scale, period. If you are caught in managing your spreadsheets, you will not be able to take, or you will have less time to take action to actually do the things that matter most, meaning reducing your emissions. So scaling throughout the organization with a platform such as Normative offers is just mandatory, I would say. Last but not least, scientific integrity. We mentioned at the very beginning, the landscape is changing so rapidly. There are new legislations coming out, but also the insights that we have around what is the current situation globally about emissions. They change, of course, year by year as the environment changes. So being connected to, for example, the UN, being connected to the gold standard of carbon accounting, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but then also knowing what are the latest science-based targets that you actually should be striving for and disclosing properly. That's something that is at the core of normative and should be at the core of your carbon accounting as well. So, to wrap up, comprehensive coverage, intelligent automation, scientific integrity, these three things will help you to bridge the accuracy gap. And this and a lot more can be found in our new guide, Enterprise Guide for Carbon Accounting, which you can, of course, access for free online. So thank you very much for this, and I'm handing over to Cassandra again.
Thank you, Alex. Let's reflect on the discussions that we've had today. So we have Christian and Alexander with me. Christian, let's start with you. Will the accuracy gap fix climate change?
I don't think the accuracy gap alone will fix climate change, but I think it's a crucial part in fixing climate change. Because we have to, again, take a step back and look at where we were, let's say, only 5 years ago. Then we had a huge commitment gap. Almost no enterprise was committed to net zero. And now we see these commitments rolling in with over 15,000 enterprises with some sort of net zero target. But in order for that net zero target to lead to reduction action, which is what we want in the end of the day, we need to bridge that accuracy gap. Because without the right level of accuracy in your value chain-based emissions and in your internal emissions, you won't know what actions to take in order to go net zero. And especially if you're a large enterprise, over the next 30 years, depending on how long your net zero target is, you need to maybe pour billions into decarbonizing that value chain. And then you would want the most bang for your buck when we're doing that investment. And you won't be able to have that data unless the accuracy gap is first fixed.
And then we also talked about the action gap, to take action on the reductions.
Yes.
Alexander, so with this guide just launched that you talked about, we say that it's everything you need to know for enterprise carbon accounting and possibly a little bit more. But who should use it? Who is it really for?
I would say the short answer should be everyone, especially if you are dialing into this webinar. Obviously, you have kind of pre-qualified, pre-selected into this group of individuals, actors, people who are engaged with the topic. So you need to be up to date with what are the steps that I as an enterprise, but also maybe from a stakeholder side can take or should be encouraging others to take. So it's really addressing quite a broad audience, I would say.
So it's relevant for businesses of all sizes.
I would say so, because ultimately you will be somewhere in a value chain of another company. So if you're not yourself an enterprise, you can still benefit from, of course, reading this material.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about the other tools we have as part of Normative's educational offering?
Yes, there are plenty, I think, over the years developed by Normative. So there are many resources you can find online, besides insights, posts, a bit like shorter pieces of education material. You'll also find longer material in there. But one thing maybe to highlight, we discussed about this, or actually the panel discussed this before, the alphabet soup of regulations and frameworks out there. So we have this carbon legislation tracker that you can actually tap into to address or to assess what am I actually compliant to, what do I have to report on and what can I report on top of this. So this is online and for free for businesses to kind of check for themselves.
Yeah. So the carbon legislation tracker is obviously a great tool, and then our whole website with insights, posts, webinars, and so on. That's excellent, Alexander. Thank you for sharing that. Christian, touching on regulation, we talked a lot about the carrot in the discussion, the opportunities, partly the stick, the risks. But regulation is really one of them. What happens if you are an enterprise required by legislation to follow through with, your carbon reporting and don't do it? What are the kind of implications of being non-compliant?
Obviously, being non-compliant is never a good thing, right? I mean, you will be fined if you're non-compliant, but I think that is kind of missing the bigger picture. I mean, in order to be relevant for the next few decades, you need a decarbonization strategy and you need solid data in order to support that strategy. So being in a situation where you have inaccurate carbon disclosures is just going to be embarrassing in front of all of your stakeholders. And I think that is the bigger cost short term. But then in the long term, and I think that was rightly so pointed out by our excellent panelists, that this is not just a compliance exercise, but in the long term, this is a value creation exercise, where if you have the right type of data, you can make your value chain more efficient, you can save money, and you can be on top of the game of investing in the latest technologies that might win you, future deals from public tender, and being more attractive to investors and future employees and so on.
Yeah. Alex, following up a little bit on Normative's work and the science department, what's next coming from your section?
Yeah, a lot of exciting things. So we have been working for the past few months with several leading researchers from academia, but also the private sector, to follow up on an idea formed during an earlier webinar, actually, about how to measure net zero success. That is a so crucial topic because companies and also stakeholders, they want to assess where does now a company, where do I myself as a company stand on my path towards net zero? And there are a lot of metrics out there, but right now they are unfortunately quite convoluted, quite confused, to be honest. So to enable to capture carbon progress verified emission reductions in a single number, that's something that we're working on right now. And there's going to be some more about this in upcoming days and weeks.
Interesting. Christian, why do we need to measure net zero success? Why do we need to compare businesses?
In the end of the day, what gets measured gets managed. And I think a good analogy here is financial accounting. If you look at financial accounting 200 years ago, you couldn't compare the profit and loss statements between different companies because they all compiled them in a different way. So stock market and financial industry was completely impossible without having comparable numbers. So we need to get to that stage of comparability where stakeholders can easily see, is this company on track on their carbon emissions? So I think that transparency piece is really important in order to have a functional market in the end of the day.
Thank you. So, Christian, tell us what the future of Normative holds for enterprises. Where are we heading now?
Great question. I think we're heading, and I said this before, into a place where what really matters in the end of the day is action. Because setting a net zero target is obviously a first great step. But by going net zero is a 10, 20, maybe 30-year commitment. So a big focus on our end will be to provide not only the accurate data, but the actionable insights on specific things that you can do to go towards net zero. So we can be a decarbonization partner with all of our clients for the next couple of decades.
Thank you. So we had a lot of interesting insights today. We spoke to the Swedish head of delegation to COP27. We talked to a member of the Swedish parliament. We had an excellent panel sharing insights from an enterprise perspective. And then obviously, Alex, you shared the latest research going forward. What would your key takeaways be from today in terms of what's next and where do we go from here? Alex?
I think in either case, irrespectively of where you stand, action is the kind of overarching theme here, I would say. It could be that you have to take action on your measurement because you have not yet done accurately so. It could be that you have measured, you have your baseline and you set maybe even targets, so follow up on the targets. Or it could be, of course, that you're already, which to be honest, few businesses are, in the follow-up stage where you are actually making progress and just have to monitor and improve upon this. But even that is, of course, a big task. So action across the board.
I completely agree. It's action across the board that matters in the end of the day. And it is to follow through on all of the commitments that has been made. Because in the end of the day, most of the technologies for decarbonization is there. So what we need is the actionable insights and to action those insights.
Yeah. And we heard from our customers while flying Tiger on how they work with actionable insights and addressing the accuracy gap hands-on. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. A big thanks to the panelists and everyone who has joined us for this webinar to listen in to what we've had to say. At Normative, we have climate experts ready to talk to you, so go on and book a demo with us if you'd like to know more about the work that we're doing, and we can help you on your net zero journey. With that, I'd like to wish you all a fantastic rest of the day.